Hey guys, welcome to a new video. Like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy. Without any further interruptions, enjoy the What If. Chapter 6. A Foiled Plan. After a good night's rest, Luffy was the first one up at around 5 a.m. and decided to go for a stroll through the village. Luffy walked for a while before ending up on one of the cliffs surrounding the southern shores of the island. He spotted a nice tree and sat down at the base of the tree and stared up at the sky while enjoying the peace and quiet. Luffy's peace and quiet was interrupted by two voices coming down on the shores of the beach. Wanting to see who it is, he got up on all fours and crawled to the edge carefully to make sure he wasn't seen or heard by whoever was down there. When Luffy reached the edge, he peeked over to see who it was, only to see Clawhador talking to a strangely dressed man. "Is everything set, Django?" Clawhador asked the man. Django took a seat on one of the nearby rocks before he replied to Clawhador. "Rest assured, everything will go accordingly to plan. Captain Kuro," Django said, causing Luffy to smile in satisfaction, having finally figured out why that butler seemed so familiar. "So, that's why you're familiar," Luffy thought as he watched the two men. "Captain Kuro of 1000 Plans, looks like I'll have some entertainment while we wait for the ship," Luffy thought to himself. He was brought out of his thought when Kuro shouted at Django. "Don't call me that idiot!" Kuro screamed. "I gave up that name a long time ago," he said as he readjusted his glasses. Django sighed before he stood up and spoke to Kuro. Fine. Just hurry up and give the signal so we can kill this rich girl and inherit her money," Django said nonchalantly. Luffy could have sworn he saw steam come out of Kuro's ears when Django said that. "You idiot, I can't get her inheritance because I am not related to her," Kuro said before he adjusted his glasses once more. "Miss Kaya need to perish in an unfortunate accident, but before she perishes in an unfortunate accident, I need you to hypnotize her and make her create a will leaving all of her fortunes to her butler, Clawhador," Kuro said with a pompous smirk on his face. Django sighed and sat down on one of the nearby rocks before he spoke again. Right, he said with a sigh. "Just hurry up and give the signal, the boys are getting bored," he said with a sadistic smirk on his face. Kuro looked at him for a while before he spoke again. "There is something that has come up which may be a hindrance to our plan," Kuro said, making Django look at him with a raised eyebrow. "There is a boy currently in the village who wears a straw hat. I want you to avoid him and his crew at all cost," Kuro said, surprising Django even more. "Why?" was all he asked. Kuro looked at him with a serious look on his face before he replied. "He has ties to one of the 4 emperors," Kuro said, making Django's eyes widen. "I doubt he will get involved, after all he is a pirate. However, if he does I will deal with him," Kuro said before he turned to leave. Django stood up and turned to leave as well, but spoke one last time before he left. "Right, I'll have the boys on the north shore at daybreak to storm the village," he said before he walked off. Kuro didn't reply to what he said, he simply walked off as well. Luffy got up from his position on the ground and started to head back to the village to tell the crew about what he had heard. After walking for a few minutes, he arrived at the inn and saw that everyone was up and Usopp was there already. Luffy then proceeded to tell them what he had heard, making Usopp dash out of the inn to warn Kaya. Luffy looked at him and shook his head before speaking to the rest of the crew. "Well, he is about to get his heart broken," Luffy said before he took out a glass and poured himself some whiskey. Nami looked confused at what he meant. "What do you mean?" she asked with a confused look all over her face. Luffy took a sip of his whiskey before he answered her. "Usopp is famous around the village for being a liar. He is about to go tell Kaya the man who her parents left in charge of taking care of her is a pirate," Luffy said before he took another sip of his drink and spoke again. "Would you believe him if you were Kaya?" he asked. Nami looked thoughtful for a moment before she shook her head, saying no. Zoro took a seat opposite his captain and spoke in a serious voice. "So, what are you going to do, Captain?" Zoro asked. Luffy downed his drink before he answered in a cold and deadly voice that sent chills down the spine of both his crewmates. "I owe a debt of gratitude to Shanks and his crew that I can never repay. So, I'll be damned if I let a small-time pirate from the East Blue run amok on the island that Yasop's wife is buried," Luffy said, causing Zoro and smirk while Nami had fear written all over her face. The crew had spent the rest of the day planning with Usopp, who had returned heartbroken as Luffy had predicted. The day had arrived, and the entire crew got up around an hour before daybreak and headed to the north shore to wait for the pirates. The group stood in a line across to the top of the slope leading up from the shore. Luffy stood there looking bored while Nami and Usopp looked scared and Zoro looked excited. Finally, the Black Cat pirates' ship docked on the shore and a large group of pirates came off the ship and started running towards the village, but stopped when they saw Luffy and his crew standing at the top of the slope. One of the pirates turned to a man who Luffy recognized to be Django and spoke. "Captain, there is a bunch of kids here," he said, causing Django to look up the slope. He looked at everyone at the top of the slope, and when his eyes landed on Luffy's straw hat he immediately grew pale and started sweating. He pointed to Luffy and spoke with a stutter. "Gee, that boy," he said, making everyone look at Luffy. "Captain Kuro said we should avoid facing him, but if we don't get by him we will have to deal with Captain Kuro himself," he said in a scared voice before he cleared his throat and screamed out an order to his men. "Men, kill them before the captain gets angry," he yelled, causing all of the pirates to charge at the group. Luffy looked at Zoro and nodded, causing him unsheathed his swords and charge at the group. Zoro started cutting down pirates left, right, and center. Usopp looked at Zoro with stars in his eyes while whispering something about being so cool. Django saw his men were dropping like flies and turned to his ship and screamed out. "Sham, Butchie, get out here now," he screamed, and two other pirates came out of the ship. Django then ordered them to attack Zoro, causing the two of them to look at Zoro in fear. The two of them reluctantly attacked Zoro while saying how scared they were until their entire demeanor changed into a more confident one, showing that they were only acting scared. Luffy watched as Zoro got two of his swords taken away from him, causing him to go on the defensive. Luffy then looked at Nami and Usopp and spoke. "Nami, Usopp," he said, getting their attention. "Go get Zoro back his swords, or else he won't win," he said, making them look at him in fear. Nami was about to protest, but the look she got from Luffy caused her to swallow her words. Luffy watched as Nami and Usopp ran down the hill towards Zoro's swords laying on the ground. Just as they were about to reach the swords, they were intercepted by Django holding some sort of metal ring tied to a string. Django then tried to hypnotize Nami and Usopp, only to have Nami use her staff to flick Zoro's swords towards him before she and Usopp began fighting Django. Luffy then turned his attention away from Nami and Usopp to Zoro. Luffy saw Zoro caught both of his swords before he started to go on the offensive. However, he was still struggling against the amazing tag team of Sham and Butchie. Luffy then saw Butchie was about to attack Zoro from behind while he was too busy fighting off Sham. He turned his body into lightning and teleported behind Butchie, getting his attention. Luffy then coated his right palm in lightning and backhanded him across the face, sending him flying down the slope, crashing into their ship's figurehead before continuing his path through the ship's cabin. "It is rude to attack a swordsman from behind," Luffy said before he looked back up the slope to see a very pissed off Kuro standing there, causing Luffy to smirk. "What the hell is going on here?" Kuro yelled, causing everyone to stop fighting and look at him. The Black Cat pirates looked scared out of their minds at the sight of Kuro. Django looked like he was about to wet himself. "See, Captain Kuro, these kids are monsters," he stuttered out, making Kuro looked at everyone there with a pissed off look on his face. When his eyes landed on a smiling Luffy, all he could do was stare at him with a look of pure hatred before he reached into the bag he was carrying and pulled out a pair of furred gloves with full-length katana blades at the end of each finger. Luffy saw this and looked at Zoro and spoke. "Finish up your fight, Zoro, and get off this slope," he said. Kuro looked at Django and spoke in a deadly tone. "You have 5 minutes to clean up this mess, Django," he said as he started to put the gloves on, "or else I'll kill you." Luffy went down the slope to help Nami take care of Django quickly while leaving Zoro to finish off Sham. When Luffy reached the bottom, Django didn't know who he should be more scared of, Kuro or the man who just slapped one of his crewmates through an entire galleon. As Luffy got closer, Django immediately tried to hypnotize him, but before he could react, Luffy was already behind up with his index finger pressed against the back of his neck. Before he could do anything, he felt an electrical shock at the base of his neck, causing him to pass out. Luffy then looked at Nami and spoke. "Why don't you go clean em out, Nami?" he said, causing her to smile widely before rushing off to the ship with Usopp to steal their treasure. Luffy then looked up the slope to see Zoro and just finished defeating his opponent and was walking towards Luffy. Kuro looked beyond pissed. He couldn't fathom how a group of kids had caused all of his plans to crumble this much. 3 years of planning had all gone down the drain thanks to these kids. He looked at Luffy and his crew with a murderous look in his eyes before he took off towards them. He was moving too fast for Zoro to track, but Luffy could see his every move. Luffy then took off after Kuro at speeds far greater than his and intercepted him in the middle of the slope with his fist buried in Kuro's stomach, causing him to fall over on all fours, gasping for air. "Why?" Kuro asked from his position on the ground, making Luffy look at him with a raised eyebrow. "Why are you getting involved?" he asked. Luffy chuckled and spoke in a deadly tone. "I'm bored. So, I'll kill time by killing you," he said, pissing Kuro off even more. Kuro then shot up and slashed at Luffy's head, but was surprised when Luffy made attempt to dodge. His eyes widened even further when his cat claws cut Luffy's head clean off, but instead of blood, all he saw was electric blue sparks of lighting from Luffy's neck and his separated head. Then suddenly Luffy's separated head turned into a bolt of lightning and reattached itself to Luffy's body. Usopp, Zoro, Nami and Kuro had their jaws on the floor at what they just saw. Luffy just stared at Kuro with an impassive look on his face before he spoke once more in a bored tone. "Is that it?" he asked. Just what are you?" asked a bewildered Kuro. Luffy chuckled a bit before he replied. "A demon," he said before he punched Kuro square of the face, sending him tumbling 15 feet back before finally coming to a stop. After about 5 minutes, Kuro shakily stood up to his feet and looked at Luffy before he spoke. My plan cannot fail," he screamed out at Luffy, causing everyone there to look at him as though he was crazy. "I think I hit him a bit too hard," Luffy joked, angering Kuro further. "I will kill you, Straw Hat. You, and your band of misfits. Then I'll make Kaya sign over all of her fortunes to me before I kill her." Kuro screamed, not noticing a teary-eyed Kaya behind him. Luffy chuckled menacingly before he spoke. "Before you do all of that, I have a question for you," Luffy said, puzzling Kuro and everyone there. "Have you ever been kicked at the speed of lightning?" Luffy asked, puzzling Kuro at first before his eyes widened when Luffy appeared crouched in front of him. Luffy then kicked him from his crouched position right under his chin, sending him flying 50 feet into the air. Luffy then turned his body into lightning and teleported to the left side of Kuro with his left foot from the knee down covered in lightning. Luffy then spun his body to the right and delivered a lightning speed kick of Kuro's midsection, sending him flying towards the ground at lightning speed, causing Kuro to break the sound barrier before he impacted the ground. The moment Kuro's body impacted the ground, it created a crater 10 feet wide with his broken body lying in the center. When Luffy landed back on the ground, he placed his hands in his pockets and investigated the crater and cringed slightly at the sight of Kuro. Kuro had 4 of his ribs sticking out of his chest, his neck of clearly broken, and his right foot was facing the wrong way. One thing was clear, the oh-so-great Captain Kuro was dead. "He did all that with just one kick," came the frightened voice of one of Black Cat pirates, getting Luffy's attention. Luffy turned to see some of the Black Cat pirates were starting to wake up, making him realize that Zoro didn't kill them. "I highly suggest you take that weird guy with the rings and get the fuck off this island before I slaughter all of you," Luffy said, making all of them scatter to pick up their fallen comrades before hopping on their ship and sailing away scared. Luffy then walked over to Kaya and spoke to her with a smile. "Miss Kaya, how about I treat you to breakfast?" he asked, making her look away from Kuro's dead body. "You've had a pretty rough start to your day. So, what do you say?" Kaya looked at Luffy teary-eyed and nodded before she spoke. "But, what about Klaha? I mean Kuro's body?" she asked. Luffy smiled before he looked up into the sky, making Kaya and the rest of his crew look up as well. They all say a small thundercloud began to descend from the sky over Kuro's body and swallowed the corpse up before returning into the sky. "What body?" Luffy asked, making Kaya smile. He then turned to his crew and spoke. "Well, are you 3 going to stand there all day because I am hungry?" he asked rhetorically, making them run towards him and Kaya before all of them walked back into the village. Timeskip. 5 days later. Luffy and the crew were currently standing on the southern shore of the island staring at their ship. The Going Merry, her cannons upgraded, the figurehead was repainted and a lot of the wood on the ship was replaced, making her a bit stronger than how she was previously. Luffy and his crew were in the middle of saying their goodbyes to Kaya and Mary when they heard someone scream behind them. They all looked up the hill to see Usopp carrying a big bag tumbling down the hill. "Someone please stop me," he screamed. Luffy and Zoro walked forward and stuck out their foot, planting it right on Usopp's face, effectively stopping him. "Thanks," Usopp said as he fell face first on the ground. "Don't mention it," replied Luffy and Zoro. Usopp then dusted himself off and told Kaya he was setting out to sea like his father to become a brave warrior. Luffy chuckled as he and Zoro boarded the ship. When Luffy got on, he leaned over the railing and spoke to Usopp. "So Usopp, are you going to join my crew?" he asked. Usopp looked up at him and placed his finger on his chin, and before thinking for a while before he replied, "I will happily join your crew as you captain," he proclaimed proudly, making Kaya giggle at his antics. "Try again," said Luffy in a deadpan voice. "As your vice captain then," he proclaimed once more. "That's Zoro. However, I do need a sniper," Luffy said. Usopp smiled before he shouted out to the heavens, "Yosh, I will be the head sniper." Usopp shouted, making everyone sweat drop. "Just hurry up and get on," Luffy said. Usopp got on board and placed his things away. Luffy then summoned the cloud that they were using for traveling and which also had all their stuff. When the thundercloud arrived, Luffy had Zoro and Usopp place the food and liquor in storage while he gave Nami her treasure. Luffy then dissipated the cloud and a medium-sized chest fell out, getting everyone's attention. "What's in the chest, Luffy?" asked Nami. Luffy walked over to the chest, picked it up before he replied to her. "Nothing you need to worry about," said a very serious Luffy before he took it into the captain quarters of the ship and locked the door. Zoro and Usopp shrugged their shoulders, not really caring about what's inside. Nami, however, stared at the closed door of Luffy's quarters with a determined look on her face. "Whatever is inside that chest must be very valuable. I will have it," she thought. Chapter 7. Finding a Cook. Luffy and his crew were currently sailing on the Going Merry towards a floating restaurant that Luffy had heard of. It is rumored to have fighting chefs, and in Luffy's mind, that is exactly what he needed. Luffy was currently sitting at the back of the ship on a throne he had made from a thundercloud. He was sitting there with a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching all his crew members do their own thing. Zoro was training. Usopp was standing not too far from Luffy getting the cannons ready for a test, and Nami was laying on a lawn chair behind Luffy reading a book on navigation. Luffy looked up on the main mast of the ship and smiled at the sight of his pirate flag with the Jolly Roger he created flying proudly. His Jolly Roger was a Japanese Hanya skull wearing a straw hat with two lightning bolts replacing the usual crossbones. Luffy had made Usopp paint a larger version of the Jolly Roger on the sails of the ship, striking fear in the hearts of his enemies from a distance. Luffy then turned towards Usopp and spoke. "Hey Usopp," he said, getting Usopp's attention. "Is it ready?" he asked. Usopp gave a wide smile before he replied. "Yes, it is all set," Usopp said before he made some ridiculous pose and began speaking again. "Just give me a target and I will show you what the great Captain Usopp can do," he said proudly, causing Luffy to sigh and take a sip of his whiskey before he replied. Luffy looked out into the distance and saw a giant rock off the starboard side of the ship. "Look over there," Luffy said while pointing at the giant rock. "I want you to hit that rock," he said. Usopp looks in the rock and began to aim the cannon. Luffy could see he was sweating a bit but didn't say anything. Usopp took aim and fired the cannon. The cannonball sailed through the air before colliding with the rock, smashing it into pieces. Luffy smiled when he saw Usopp hit his target. He was a sniper just like his father. All Luffy needed to do was get him to stop acting like a coward. "Good job Usopp," Luffy said, congratulating him. Usopp turned to Luffy and smiled and made another ridiculous pose before he spoke. "You can expect only the best from the great Captain Usopp," he proclaimed proudly. Luffy shook his head before he looked over at Zoro and yelled out. "Zoro," he called out, getting Zoro's attention. "Could you come here for a second?" he said before looking over at Nami and spoke again. "You too Nami," he said, causing her to close her book and walk over to Luffy. When everyone arrived, Luffy stuck his hand into the cloud that he was sitting on and pulled out 3 bags that obviously had something in them. "What's with the bags, Captain?" Zoro asked. "I think it is time to give all of you your share in Kuro's bounty," Luffy said, making Nami's eyes to turn into belly signs. "Kuro's bounty was 16 million and there is 4 of us. So, it is 4 million a person," Luffy said as he handed the bag to each of them. Usopp thanked Luffy and so did Nami. However, after thanking him, she immediately began cuddling with the bag of money, causing the 3 guys to look at her funny. When Luffy handed the bag to Zoro, he took it before he spoke to Luffy. Could you hold on to it, for now, Captain?" he asked as he handed the money back to Luffy. Luffy nodded and took the money and placed it back into the cloud. Usopp then handed Luffy the money back and asked the same thing, to which Luffy agreed and then looked over to Nami to see if she wanted him to hold on to hers as well. Nami shook her head vigorously, saying no. Luffy just shrugged before he spoke in a serious voice once more. "Just so we are clear," he said, getting all their attention. "This is probably one of the few times I am going to be sharing a bounty with you," Luffy said, puzzling Nami and Usopp. "What do you mean, Luffy?" Nami asked. "As I already told Zoro, the treasure we find and loot from other pirates and marines will be divided equally among the crew. However, any bounties we get from defeating someone with a bounty on their head is going to who defeated that person," Luffy said, earning a nod from Usopp and a pout from Nami, which he ignored. Luffy then stood up, causing the thundercloud to rise into the sky before he began walking towards the kitchen. "I am hungry, let's eat," he said, causing his crew to follow behind him. Upon entering the kitchen, Luffy sat down at the table and refilled his glass before he turned towards Zoro and spoke. "How much food do we have left?" he asked. Zoro walked over to the fridge and looked inside before he replied. "We have about 2 days' worth of food left," he said. Luffy nodded his head before he turned towards Nami. "How long till we reach the restaurant?" he asked. Nami looked outside and looked at the map before she replied to Luffy's question. "We should reach there in a few hours if the wind keeps up," she said. Luffy took a sip of his drink before he spoke. "Well, it seems we will be okay," he said, earning a nod from everyone. "In the event that we do not get a cook from the restaurant, we will stock on food there before we move on," Luffy said. Before anyone could say anything, they all heard a loud crash outside and a man yelling. "Get out here, you damn pirates!" a man yelled from outside, startling the crew. Luffy got up and walked out of the kitchen to see who in their right mind thought it was a good idea to attack his ship. As he opened the door and looked down at the deck, he saw a very angry man wielding a sword staring up at him. "You better have a damn good reason for being on my ship," Luffy said in a menacing tone as he jumped down from the upper deck. The man stood in front of Luffy with his sword raised in the air and yelled out. "And now you think you can kill my partner?" he yelled as he swung his sword to cut Luffy in half. Luffy easily saw the swing coming and stepped out of the way. However, the moment he stepped out of the way, the man's sword collided with one of the railings of the ship, effectively breaking it apart, and that pissed Luffy off. Luffy teleported in front of the man, scaring the crap out of him before he grabbed his head and flung him across the ship, causing him to slam into the wall of the captain's quarters. Luffy looked up at the upper deck to see Zoro walking towards the edge of the railing to see who it is Luffy was fighting. Zoro saw the man and his eyes were immediately widened, causing Luffy to raise an eyebrow at Zoro's reaction. Before Luffy could question him about it, Zoro spoke. "Johnny, is that you?" Zoro asked while looking at the man now named Johnny with a surprised look on his face. "Where is Yosaku?" Zoro asked again before the man Johnny could reply to the first question. Johnny looked up at Zoro from his position on the ground to see who was calling his name. The moment he saw Zoro, he immediately sprang to his feet and spoke to Zoro. "Big bro Zoro," he yelled, asked, "why are you on a pirate ship?" he asked again. Zoro sighed before he spoke again. "Would you calm down?" Zoro said as he began walking down the stairs. "Where is Yosaku?" Zoro asked again. Johnny then began to tear up before he ran to the side of the ship, causing Luffy and Zoro to follow him. Then they got there, they saw a man lying on the small boat looking ill. "He's been sick," Johnny said. Zoro signed before he turned towards Luffy, who simply nodded before walking away. Zoro then turned back to Johnny and spoke. "Bring him on board," Zoro said to Johnny, causing him to nod his head rapidly. When Johnny jumped off the ship to get his friends, Luffy spoke to Zoro. "I take it you know these two?" he asked as he sat on a nearby barrel. Zoro sighed and walked over to Luffy before he spoke. "Yeah, I met them a while back during my bounty hunting days," he said, causing Luffy to nod his head. "They're good people," Zoro said as he watched Johnny drag Yosaku's body on the ship. Zoro then walked over to them and spoke. "What's wrong with him?" he asked. "Up until a few days ago, he was healthy and full of life. And now he keeps fainting and getting pale," said a very emotional Johnny. Nami and Usopp had just arrived next to Luffy and Zoro on the deck of the ship as Johnny explained what was wrong with Yosaku. "So, I thought maybe we should rest on a little island, but then a cannonball came flying from this ship," he said, causing Luffy and Usopp's eyes to widen. Luffy chuckled nervously a bit before he spoke. "Yay, sorry about that," Luffy said as he got up from the barrel and walked over to Johnny while ignoring Usopp's rapid apologies. "Don't worry about your friend," Luffy said, causing Zoro and Johnny to look at him, waiting for him to elaborate on what he meant by that. Luffy then turned towards Usopp and gave an order. "Head into the kitchen and bring all the limes we got," he said, causing Usopp to nod his head rapidly before he dashed into the kitchen. "What does he have, big bro?" Johnny asked Luffy. Luffy turned towards him and was about to speak, but Nami beat him to it. "He has scurvy," she said, making Johnny look to Luffy for confirmation, to which he nodded. When Usopp returned, Luffy told him to squeeze the lime juice into Yosaku's mouth. Usopp got to squeezing while Luffy went back to sit on the barrel. "Scurvy is caused by a deficiency of plant-derived nutrients like vitamin C," Luffy said from his position on the barrel. "You and your friend are two morons," Luffy said, surprising Zoro, Usopp, and Johnny while Nami simply nodded her head in agreement. "Every sailor should know about scurvy before they set out to sea, dumbass," Luffy said, causing Johnny to look down in shame. "But don't worry, your friend will live," he said, causing Johnny and Zoro to take on a bright smile on their faces. Just as Luffy finished speaking, Yosaku shot up into a sitting position before looking around trying to figure out where he was. When his eyes landed on Johnny, he smiled and shot up to his feet and started dancing with Johnny. "I'm cured," Yosaku shouted as he and Johnny danced around. Luffy sighed and looked towards Nami and nodded. Nami then slugged the two of them over the head and began scolding them about not being cured just yet. Just as she started to scold them, Yosaku passed out again. Luffy sighed and looked towards Zoro. "Take him inside and have him get some rest," Luffy said, earning a nod from Zoro. Luffy then walked back to the back of the deck and summoned his cloud throne again and sat down. Johnny, Zoro, Nami, and Usopp soon joined Luffy at the back of the ship. Luffy then turned towards Nami and asked a question. "How long till we get there?" he asked. Nami looked ahead of the ship and replied. "I would say less than an hour," she said while pointing off into the distance ahead of the ship. Luffy and the others looked ahead and saw a tiny silhouette of something which Luffy assured as the restaurant. "Ah, I see you guys are going to the Bharati," Johnny said, getting all of their attention. "You've been there?" asked Nami, to which Johnny nodded. "Yes, I have," he said. "The food is to die for. However, lately I've been hearing rumors about a certain hawk-eyed man showing up there," he said while looking at Zoro. The moment Luffy and Zoro heard what he said, both smiled a bit. However, Luffy's smile was less noticeable compared to Zoro's. When the ship was about 50 feet away from the restaurant, Luffy and the crew was startled by a loud horn and the sound of bells ringing coming off of the starboard side of the ship. Everyone looked over to see a marine ship coming up beside them, causing all of their eyes to widen at the fact that the marines snuck up on them so easily. Luffy got up from his throne and walked down towards the main deck of the ship before he jumped up on one of the rails and stood there staring at the marines with Zoro by his side. "I have never seen that pirate flag before," a pink-haired marine said as he walked over to the edge of the marine ship. "I am Iron Fist Full Body, but you can just call me sir," said the marine as he stared at Luffy. Luffy could tell he was one of those marines who were too cocky for their own good. "I don't recall ever asking who you were, marine," Luffy said in an emotionless tone. Full Body was clearly pissed off by Luffy's comment, so he clenched his fist and slammed it on one of the rails of the marine ship before he yelled at Luffy. "Just who do you think you are, punk?" yelled Full Body. "Me," Luffy asked while pointing at himself. "I am Monkey D. Luffy, the captain of this ship," he said. Why is it that I don't recognize your flag? Asked Full Body. Luffy looked at him like he was an idiot before he replied. Well, maybe because it is only a day old, Luffy said. As Luffy said that, he noticed Full Body's face took on a cocky smirk before he began to chuckle. Is it? He asked in a condescending tone. Full Body was about to speak again, but something caught his eye. He looked over towards the main cabin of Luffy's ship to see two men hiding there. Luffy looked over to see what Full Body was looking at and saw Johnny and Yosaku peeking out of the door. You two, he said while looking at Johnny and Yosaku. You're that bounty hunting duo that goes after the small fish, Full Body said mockingly. A beautiful woman in a red dress then walked out from behind Full Body and spoke to him. Come on babe, let's go, she said as she latched onto Full Body's arm. Full Body looked at her and nodded before he turned his back to Luffy and the crew and began walking away. As he was walking away, Johnny jumped out and pulled out a large stack of wanted posters and threw it in the air and screamed. Do you think small-time bounty hunters will go after these guys? He yelled as the wanted posters scatter all over the ship. Full Body paid no attention to him. Instead, he looked to his marines and gave out an order before leaving the ship. They're an eyesore, sink 'em, he said before leaving. As he said that, the marines aimed one of their cannons right at Luffy, causing him to narrow his eyes. They're pointing a cannon right at us, Usopp screamed. Luffy held up his hand, silencing Usopp before he spoke. Relax, I'll handle it, he said, shutting, causing everyone except Nami to look at him to see what he was about to do. Without any warning, the marines fired their cannons right at Luffy. Luffy just stood there and stared at the incoming cannonball before he stuck out his right hand and caught the cannonball, causing all of the marines, Usopp, Johnny, and Yosaku's eyes to widen. Now, that wasn't ever nice, Luffy said in a tone that made the marines wanted to shit themselves. Luffy then pulled his arm back and sent some lightning into the cannonball, causing blue spack of sliding to be seen around the black ball. He then threw the cannonball at lightning speed towards the marine ship's main mast. The cannonball then collided with the main mast and exploded, destroying the mast and a large chunk of the deck, while also sending a group of marines flying back. Johnny and Yosaku stared at the scene with their jaws wide open. They had never seen anything like this before. They had heard stories of people with devil fruits and the things they can do, but they never actually saw someone with one. Full Body, who was already on a small dinghy with the woman in the red dress and two marines, quickly ordered the two marines to turn the dinghy back around after they heard the explosion on their ship. Luffy hopped off the railing and turned to face his crew. He was about to speak, but Johnny spoke before he even had a chance. Wow, big bro Luffy, he said as Yosaku stared at Luffy. You took out that a navy ship with just one move, he said, causing Luffy to turn and look at the burning marine ship and spoke. They're lucky I didn't completely destroy the damn thing, he said, causing their eyes to widen. Luffy then turns back towards his crew and spoke. I'm hungry, let's go eat, he said as he formed a small boat out of a thundercloud to fly everyone to the restaurant. As everyone was boarding the small cloud, Luffy saw Nami staring at a wanted poster in her hand, causing Luffy to narrow his eyes at her. Just what are you hiding? Luffy thought to himself before he turned and hopped into the cloud. When Luffy hopped on, a few seconds later Nami joined them with an obviously fake smile on her face, which Luffy saw right through. Luffy leaned over to Zoro, who was sitting next to him, and whispered in his ear. Keep an eye on Nami for me, he said, causing Zoro to look at him weirdly before nodding and narrowing his eyes at the back of Nami's head. When the crew reached the door of the restaurant, they hopped off the cloud and Luffy shoved the two large doors open. When the doors opened, everyone in the restaurant stopped what they were doing and turned to look at Luffy and his crew. It was obvious that they were pirates, and it was even more obvious who their captain was based on how Luffy was dressed. Luffy noticed a few women in the restaurant was looking at him with small blushes on their faces. Luffy saw a man walking up to them holding a silver platter. He was an average-sized, muscular man with a lot of hair on his arms and legs, wearing a navy blue short-sleeved shirt with yellow buttons on both sides, and light blue on the end of the sleeves. He had on knee-length shorts that are the same color as his shirt, along with brown shoes. He also wore a white apron, a pink ascot, an earring in his right ear, and a white rope tied around his head. Hello and welcome to the Bharati, he said with a smile on his face, which Luffy clearly saw was fake. May I ask how you will be paying for your meal? He asked, causing Luffy to chuckle before he replied. With money, of course, he replied, causing Patty's fake smile to be replaced with a real one before he spoke again. Well then, allow me to show you to your table, he said before leading Luffy and the crew towards an empty table. Your waiter will be with you in a moment to take your order, he said as he handed out the menus. Luffy nodded his head in acknowledgement before looking through the menu. 5 minutes later, a blonde-haired man wearing a black suit came over to the table and spoke. Hello, my name is Sanji. I am the sous chef here but will be acting as your waiter for today, he said with a cigarette in his mouth. Chapter 8. Defending the Baratie. Luffy and the crew were currently sitting down at one of the tables in the Baratie enjoying the meal they had ordered. Luffy ordered a bottle of whiskey with a large platter of meat, Nami ordered a glass of wine to go with a salad, Usopp ordered a medium seafood platter with a bottle of Coke while Zoro, Johnny, and Yosaku ordered a large meat platter and 2 bottles of sake. The entire crew was sitting there enjoying their meal, laughing with each other, and having a good time. Then suddenly the doors of the restaurant were roughly shoved open, gaining the attention of everyone that was in there. Everyone looked at the door to see a very pissed off Full Body standing there breathing heavily while giving Luffy the death stare. Luffy just looked at him for a second before he went back to his meal. Full Body saw this and it pissed him off even more. He stomped into the restaurant making a beeline straight towards Luffy. The people in the restaurant along with Luffy's crew began to get nervous while Zoro placed his hands on his swords getting ready to fight for his captain. When Full Body reached Luffy, he stood on the right side of Luffy staring down at him as he was eating. Just who do you think you are? Asked a very angry Full Body rather loudly for everyone in the restaurant to hear. Luffy didn't even bat his eyelashes at him, he just continued eating his food. Because of you, my men are either dead or seriously wounded and my ship is in chaos. He yelled at Luffy. Luffy looked up from his food and looked at Full Body before H spoke in a bored tone. Well, maybe you shouldn't have attacked me, Luffy said before going back to his meal. Full Body was now enraged by the way Luffy simply dismissed him as though he was nobody. He was a Navy lieutenant from Navy HQ, this was completely acceptable. So, he raised his fist in the air and slammed it on the table, spilling everyone's drink except for Luffy's because he picked his drink and his plate up when he sensed what Full Body was about to do. Do you have any idea who I am? Shouted Full Body. Luffy sat his drink and plate back down before he answered him. Are you a Navy admiral? Luffy asked calmly, startling Full Body by the question. Because if you're not one and you continue to annoy me. Luffy paused and looked up at Full Body with the cold emotionless eyes of someone who will kill you without hesitation before he spoke again. Quote, You will surely die here today. When Luffy said that, Full Body unconsciously took a step back before he regained his senses and was about to speak. But before he could say anything, the waiter that was in charge of serving Luffy's table came over and spoke. Is there a problem over here, sir? Sanji asked Luffy. Luffy looked up at Sanji and smiled before he replied. Yes, there is, Luffy said before pointing his fork at Full Body. This gentleman here is disturbing my meal, he said. Full Body looked at Sanji before he looked back at Luffy and yelled. I don't care about your meal. He screamed as he picked up Luffy's plate off the table and began to examine it before he spoke again. And this food looks disgusting, he stated before tossing the plate of food over his shoulder. Luffy was about to blast him right out of the restaurant with a bolt of lightning, but before he could, Sanji performed an amazing spinning heel kick that connected to Full Body's head and sent him flying across the restaurant. As Sanji began walking over towards a down Full Body, Luffy turned to his crew and smiled before he spoke. I think I found our cook, he said, causing Zoro to voice his complaints. Why do we need that perverted cook? He yelled, causing Luffy to chuckle. Don't worry about it, I am sure you two will get along great, Luffy said with an amused smile. Luffy then turned to see what Sanji was doing and saw him and Patty along with another chef, who had a wooden leg, a really tall hat and an impressive mustache, kicking Full Body towards the door. When Full Body reached the door and began to shakingly get up, one of his surviving Marines came bursting in the door. Lieutenant Full Body, the Marine yelled, getting everyone's attention. We've got trouble, the prisoner has escaped, Pirate Kriega's henchmen attacked us and vanished, the Marine said. Full Body's eyes went wide before he replied. What, that is impossible. When we picked him up 3 days ago he was on the verge of starving to death and we haven't fed him anything, so where did he get the strength? Quote. Full Body asked. Luffy looked around the restaurant and saw everyone was beginning to panic when they heard Kriga's name, which confused Luffy because he had never heard of a pirate named Kriga. Luffy then turned his attention back to Full Body and the Marine to listen to what they were saying in order to get some information. I'm sorry, Lieutenant, Bang. The sound of a gunshot rang out through the entire restaurant and the next thing everyone saw was the Marine drop dead on the ground. Standing behind the now dead Marine holding a smoking gun was a man in a gray tracksuit who looked like he was on the verge of death. The man walked into the restaurant and sat down at one of the vacant tables before he spoke. I do not care what it is, just bring me something to eat, he said, causing Patty to walk over to him with a large fake smile on his face and spoke. Hello and welcome, you damn crook, he said happily, causing the remaining guest to jump back in fear. Might I be so bold to inquire how you will be paying for your meal? Patty asked. The pirate looked up at him and pointed his gun right between Patty's eyes before he replied. Would a bullet be enough? He said. Patty's face lost its smile and took on a more angry look. So, you don't have any money then? Patty asked before he slammed his fist on top of the pirate's head, breaking the chair the pirate was sitting on and sending crashing in the ground. Even if you are a pirate, we only cook for paying customers. Patty said before two other chefs came and picked the pirate up and take him to the back of the restaurant. What no one seemed to have noticed was that Sanji had left the commotion that was going on between the cooks and the pirate and went back to the kitchen. Luffy turned towards his crew and spoke. Wait here, I'll be back, said before he got up and headed in the direction of where the chefs took the pirate. When Luffy opened the door leading to the back of the restaurant, he saw the pirate laying on the ground hunched over holding his stomach. Luffy stepped outside and stood against the rail of the ship and stared at the pirate for a while before he spoke. What's your name, pirate? He asked, getting the pirate's attention. The pirate looked up from the ground and stared at Luffy and was about to speak, but before he could, a plate of food was placed in front of him along with a glass of water. The pirate and Luffy both looked to see who it was that placed it here and saw Sanji standing there with smoking a cigarette. Eat, Sanji said before moving to stand next to Luffy. The Kriga pirate stared at the food and began to tear up before he yelled at Sanji. I don't want your charity, he said before pushing the plate of food away. Sanji looked at him for a while before he spoke. Shut up and eat, he said before taking a long pull of his cigarette before he spoke again. It is unwise to refuse food on the open sea. If you do not eat that food you will surely die by tomorrow morning, Sanji said nonchalantly, causing the pirate's eyes to widen. After trying to argue with Sanji for a few more minutes, the pirate finally gave in and ate the food. Luffy just stood there watching the interaction with an emotionless look on his face while waiting for the pirate to answer his question. When the pirate finished eating, Luffy decided to remind him of his question. You still haven't answered my question, pirate, he said, getting the pirate's attention. The pirate looked at Luffy for a while before he replied. Forgive me, my name is Jin, better known as Man Demon, Jin. I am the right-hand man to the great pirate Admiral Don Kriga, he said proudly. Never heard of him, Luffy said plainly, causing both Sanji and Jin's eyes to widen. What the hell do you mean by you don't know who Don Kriga is? Sanji yelled, earning a nod from Jin. Luffy simply shrugged his shoulders as he replied. It's just as I said, I never heard of him, Luffy said, earning another disbelieving look from the two of them. Luffy then turned towards Sanji and spoke once again. If I remember correctly, your name is Sanji, correct? Luffy asked, earning a nod from Sanji. Good. I want you to join my crew, Luffy said, surprising Sanji. As interesting as that offer sounds, I have to refuse. I owe the owner a debt that I cannot repay, he said. Luffy looked at him with a bored look on his face and spoke. I refuse your refusal, Luffy said, causing Sanji's jaw to drop at Luffy's statement. Sanji was about to yell at Luffy, but Jin spoke before he could. Pardon me, Jin said, getting Luffy's attention. By chance are you a pirate? He asked, earning a nod from Luffy. And what are your dreams, if you don't mind me asking? Jin asked, earning a confused look from Sanji, wondering where he was going with all this. Conquer the Grand Line, find the One Piece and become king of the pirates, Luffy said nonchalantly. I see. Allow me to give you some advice as someone who has been to the Grand Line, he said, earning an amused look from Luffy and a curious look from Sanji. Stay away from that place. Our entire fleet of 50 ships went in there and only lasted a week before our entire fleet was destroyed by one man, Jin said, surprising Sanji and causing Luffy to chuckle before he replied. That just means you guys were too weak to survive paradise, Luffy said, earning a pissed off look from Jin. Before Jin could speak, Luffy cut him off and spoke first. It doesn't matter how much ships you have in your fleet and how much men you have. Only the strong can survive, and I know that because I am from the Grand Line, Luffy said, causing the two of their jaws to drop. Why, you're from the Grand Line? Jin asked, to which Luffy nodded. I see. I guess you will be more prepared than we ever were, Jin said sadly. Luffy didn't say anything, he simply pushed off the rail headed towards the door. As he opened the door to re-enter the restaurant, he turned towards Sanji and spoke. I won't be leaving here until you join my crew, Sanji, he said before he walked inside, closing the door behind him before Sanji could reply. As he returned to his crew, he saw they were still eating, so he decided to join them and finish his meal. About 4 hours had passed since Luffy had his conversation with Jin and Sanji. Currently, Luffy and his crew were sitting at the same table drinking and conversing, getting to know each other a bit more. Luffy had told the crew that he wasn't leaving here without Sanji, so they were going to be there till then. As the crew was sitting there chatting with each other, a large shadow was cast over the restaurant, gaining everyone's attention. A random customer got up from their table and looked out the window to see what was casting the shadow over the restaurant. When the man looked outside the window, his entire body began to shake and a look of pure fear could be seen. The man started to back away from the window in fear before he started to stutter. It's the Dreadnought Saber. It's Don Krieg's ship, he yelled before he ran back to his table. After he said that, everyone in the restaurant began to panic. Luffy just sat there watching the chaos as it unfolded. Suddenly the doors of the restaurant were blown open and standing there was Jin with a man who looked like he was on the verge of dying slung over his shoulder. Jin dragged himself and the man into the restaurant and began to beg for food and water. Please bring us some food and water, Jin begged while barely being able to hold up his the man Luffy fee assumed as Don Krieg. We have money, he said as he pleaded with the restaurant staff. To say the chefs and the customers in the restaurant were shocked would be an understatement. They had their eyes widen and their jaws hanging. The only people whose face lacked any emotion was Luffy, Zoro, Sanji, and the owner Zeph. The rest of Luffy's crew were just as shocked as the rest of the customers. Then all of a sudden Krieg fell face first on the ground, causing Jin to beg some more. When that happened, Luffy noticed Sanji heading towards the kitchen. Patty then denied him the food and water, causing the rest of the chefs to start making comments on how much of a monster Krieg is. Don Krieg then did the unthinkable in Luffy's opinion. He bowed his head and began to beg the chefs for food. Jin tried to stop him and pleaded for him to raise his head, but Krieg didn't listen. Instead he continued to beg for food. He even went as far as to beg for the scraps. The next that happened was Luffy hearing Sanji's voice. Hey, step aside Patty, Sanji said before kicking Patty in the face, sending him crashing in the wall. Sanji then walked over to Jin and Don Krieg and placed a bowl of food and a bottle of sake in front of him. Here is something for your captain, he said as he placed the bowl on the ground. Krieg then began to gulp down the food using his bare hands like a wild animal. One of the chefs then ran down the stairs and yelled at Sanji to get the food away from him, but Sanji did nothing. He only stood there watching the chef with a bored expression on his face. Krieg then slammed the bottle on the ground and sprang to his feet before he punched Sanji, sending him flying. The people in the restaurant started running for the exit, leaving only the chefs and Luffy's crew behind to face Don Krieg. Luffy then sensed something with his observation haki that made him smile before he turned towards his crew and spoke. Hey, go move the ship to the other side of the restaurant. We are about to have more guests, he said, making Nami, Usopp, Johnny, and Yosaku run outside to move the ship, leaving him and Zoro in the restaurant. Luffy then turned his attention back to Krieg. This is a pretty good ship, I believe I'll take it, Krieg said with a sinister look on his face. As you can all see, my ship is a wreck. Naturally, I will be needing a nice new one. After a few small chores, one of you will leave this ship, he said, causing one of the chefs to protest. What? No, One random chef yelled out, but Krieg paid him no mind. There are about 100 men left on my ship. All are weak with hunger and many are seriously wounded. If you value your lives, you will prepare food and water for every last one of them, he said. You're telling us to feed our executioners. Do you hear how stupid that sounds? We refuse, Patty said. I am not asking you, I am telling you to do it, Krieg said, making all of the cooks tremble in fear while Luffy simply scoffed. Sanji then goes up and announced that he will be cooking for 100 people and began to walk towards the kitchen, but was stopped by all the rest of the cooks who pointed large knives and forks at him and began accusing him of being a spy for Krieg. Patty then knocked Sanji to the ground before walking over a small door at the bottom of the stairs and pulled out a rather large handheld cannon before pointing it at Don Krieg and firing it. The cannonball sailed through the air at amazing speed before colliding with Krieg and creating a whole lot of smoke in the restaurant. The cooks started celebrating their victory but were immediately silenced by Krieg's voice coming from inside the smoke. Are you a chef or a comedian? Because your jokes are lame, Krieg said, scaring all of the cooks and surprising Luffy a bit. When the smoke cleared, everyone saw Krieg standing there in golden armor with guns coming out of his shoulder along with 2 pistols in his hand. He then pointed them at the group of chefs and yelled, "So, die," he screamed as he fired his weapons. "You cooks should not have defied me, I am the world's strongest man," he yelled boastfully. Luffy wanted to laugh so hard at his comment about being the strongest man alive but held it in. Luffy then heard someone's footsteps and turned and looked up the stairs and saw the owner carrying a large sack walking down the stairs and heading to Krieg. Zeph placed the large sack down in front of Krieg and spoke. "This is about 100 meals. Now, take it to your men right away," he said in a serious voice. "Owner Zeph, what are you doing?" asked all of the other cooks simultaneously. Krieg, on the other hand, looked shocked beyond belief. "You're Redfoot Zeph," Krieg whispered out, causing Luffy's eyes to widen. I know his name sounded familiar, Luffy thought to himself. Zeph then walked away from Krieg and headed back to stand with his chefs. "Owner Zeph, why did you do that?" one of the chefs asked. "If his men regain their strength, they will kill us," the chef yelled in a scared voice. "That is only if they still have their will to fight," Zeph said before he turned and looked at Krieg. "Tell me, did your will survive defeat?" Zeph asked Krieg, causing all of the chefs to look at Krieg in disbelief. Not even a pirate ship with 50 ships could make it on the Grand Line, Patty asked in disbelief. Krieg, however, just stared at Zeph for a while before he spoke. "It is you, isn't it? You're Redfoot Zeph," he said once more. "So, you are alive, the unrivaled pirate captain who was also the ship's cooks," he said. "Yes, that is right, I am still alive, but what does any of this have to do with you?" Zeph asked a question that Luffy also wanted to know. "I haven't been a pirate for many years now. I chose the life of a cook," Zeph said, making Krieg start laughing before he spoke. "Chose the life of a cook, huh? Yay, right. You didn't have a choice, old man. You live as a cook because the only thing you can be now is a cook," Krieg said while pointing to Zeph's wooden leg. Krieg then went on to tell the legend of Redfoot Zeph for everyone to hear. "Enough chit-chat, let's get to the point. What do you want from me?" Zeph asked, causing Don Krieg to smirk evilly at him before he replied. "You're the man who sailed the treacherous seas of the Grand Line and came back unharmed," Krieg said, causing everyone including Luffy to look at Zeph with a look of pure shock on their face. "There should be a log book detailing your tactics, a full year of your journey there." "Give it to me," Krieg said, making Luffy narrow his eyes at him. "Yes, there is such a book in my possession, but I will never hand it over to the likes of you," Zeph said, causing Krieg to take on a pissed-off look on his face. "That log book is the erd of the crewmen I sailed with. It is far too important to give to you," Zeph said. Luffy could understand why Zeph wouldn't want to give up that book, especially if the men who Zeph served with had perished in the accident that took his leg. It was far too scared of a treasure to any decent captain to just hand over to another. "Then I'll just take it," Krieg said, knocking Luffy out of his thought. "Yes, it is true that the Grand Line beat me. Still, I will never give up on it, for I am Don Krieg. It is just another ocean. I had enough men, enough weapons, and enough ambition. Regrettably, the only thing I lacked was information, but now I will fix all of that." Once I have your log book I will form another pirate fleet and capture the legendary One Piece." Krieg yelled, causing everyone to fall silent. The silence was broken by the sound of laughter, causing everyone to look at Luffy, who was laughing as he began to get up from his seat. "Man, that was the funniest thing I had in a while," Luffy said as he got up from his seat and looked at Krieg. "You think you having that log book that means you are going to survive the Grand Line?" "Don't make me laugh," Luffy said as he stood in the middle of the restaurant between the chefs and Krieg. "It doesn't matter how much men or ships you have, it doesn't matter how much information about that place you have. It all means shit if you are weak. And you Krieg are as weak as they come," Luffy said, causing all of the chefs including Zeph's eyes to widen at Luffy's statement. Krieg looked beyond pissed that some kid was talking down to him and calling him weak. "Just who do you think you are, punk?" Krieg asked in a dangerous voice that made some of the cooks tremble in fear. Luffy was about to respond, but before he could, Jin spoke. "Don Krieg," Jin said, getting his attention, "he is the pirate I told you about. The one from the Grand Line," Jin said, making everyone look at Luffy in awe. Krieg stared at Luffy for a while and was about to speak, but Luffy spoke before he could. "I mean, come on Krieg, you couldn't even survive paradise for a week and you think that you are going to be able to conquer the Grand Line and find the One Piece? Get real," Luffy said as he began walking towards Krieg. When Luffy was within the reach of Krieg, he tried to punch Luffy with a glove that had a rather large diamond on it. Luffy saw it coming and caught the fist with his left hand, causing Krieg's eyes to widen. Before Krieg could fire any one of his weapons, Luffy flipped Krieg in the air and slammed them down on the ground while still holding on to his fist. "Don Krieg," Jin yelled as he stared at his captain laying on the ground staring at Luffy in disbelief. Luffy looked over to Jin and spoke. "Don't worry Jin, I won't kill him," he said, surprising everyone. "He is Hawkeye's prey," Luffy said, causing Jin's eyes to widen in fear along with Krieg's. Luffy then let go of Krieg and went back to sit next to Zoro before he spoke to Krieg again. "I suggest you go feed your men, cause he will be here any moment now," Luffy said, causing Zoro to look at the door excitedly. "Shouldn't have interrupted his nap," Luffy added before taking a sip of his whiskey. Krieg got up from the floor and walked over to the bag containing food, picked it up and began to leave. As he was out of the door, he turned towards Zeph and spoke. "In 1 hour I will come back for this restaurant. Anyone still in here will die," he said before he left. Luffy simply scoffed at him. Luffy then looked at Zeph and spoke. "Hey, old man," Luffy said, getting Zeph's attention. "I'll kick Krieg's ass for you if you give me that chef," he said while pointing at Sanji. Zeph smiled and replied. "You got yourself a deal, kid," he said, causing Sanji to protest, but everyone ignored it. Chapter 9. Betrayal and the World's Strongest Swordsman. "It's been a while, hasn't it, Luffy?" asked a man standing on a coffin-shaped boat. Luffy smirked before he replied. "Indeed it has, Hawkeye," Luffy said as he stared at the man now named Hawkeye. All of the chefs had come outside and are now standing behind Luffy and Zeph, who stood there watching Hawkeye's interaction with the Krieg pirates. Zoro, who was Luffy's right, was staring at Hawkeye with a look of pure excitement. "There he is, the greatest swordsman in the world," Zoro though excitedly as he placed his hands on his swords. "I didn't think I would meet him so soon, but I am not about to back down now," he thought with conviction. Before he could continue his thought, the voice of one of the cooks interrupted his thought. "How did he split that giant galleon in half?" yelled a random cook. Zoro too had wondered that. How did one man break a ship that size into two? It was at that time Luffy chuckled a bit before he provided everyone an answer to the cook's question. "He cut it," Luffy said while narrowing his eyes at Hawkeye while everyone else stared at Luffy waiting for him to elaborate a bit more, but he never did. Zeph saw the confusion on his chef's and Zoro's face and decided to try and help them understand. "That man right there is Dracula Mihawk, also known as Hawkeye. He is the greatest swordsman in the world," Zeph said, surprising the chefs. Mihawk was a tall, lean man with black hair, a short beard, mustache, and sideburns that point upwards. His eyes were strangely colored yellow, which resembled a hawk. He wore a black and red ornate clothing with a crucifix pendant, which gives him the appearance of a Spanish swordsman. His attire consists of a wide-brimmed black hat decorated with a large plume, and a long, open black coat with no shirt underneath, with red, flower-patterned sleeves and collar. He had on light purple pants held up by a decorated belt and tucked inside overly large boots in comparison to his leg size. And if you are wondering what he cut that ship with, he cut it with that sword that is strapped to his back, Zeph said, causing everyone looking at Mihawk's back to get a look at the swords. The blade was an ornately decorated and very long blade. On the hilt of this blade is a cross guard, though the bars between the blade and the hilt are much longer than average. The blade itself is pitch black with a very strong sheen, a single-edged longsword with a slight curve at the end of the blade. Overall, the blade looks like a large black cross. One of the chefs looked like he was about to say something about Mihawk's sword, but as he was about to, Mihawk reached behind him and grabbed the hilt of his sword, getting ready to draw it, causing Luffy to narrow his eyes and placing his hand on his sword, getting ready to defend himself if necessary. Everyone held their breath waiting to see what Mihawk was about to do. Luffy was about to ask him what he is planning, but before he could speak, Zoro walked out from behind Luffy and moved to stand beside Luffy with his green bandana tied around his head. Luffy turned and looked at him to see what he was planning, but with one look Luffy already knew what Zoro was planning. As Zoro was about to jump off of the restaurant and head towards Mihawk, Luffy grabbed him by the back of his shirt collar and tossed Zoro behind him. Zoro, being surprised by Luffy's action, jumped up to his feet and yelled at him. "Why the hell did you do that?" he asked, yelled. Luffy kept his eyes on Mihawk and didn't even turn towards Zoro as he replied. "You were about to throw away your life for no reason," Luffy said, pissing Zoro off. "What is that supposed to mean?" Zoro asked angrily. "Are you saying I can't beat him?" he yelled out. Luffy, who still had his back towards him, spoke in his usual emotionless tone. "That is exactly what I am saying," Luffy said, surprising the Krieg pirates and the chefs there. "You have no idea just how big the ocean is and just how small a fish you are in that ocean," Luffy said as he unsheathed his sword and raised it in the air before he continued to speak. "If you can't even do this, you are no way ready to challenge the world's greatest," he said. As he finished speaking, Luffy brought his sword down in one swift motion aimed at the already split in half Krieg pirate ship. As Luffy's sword came down, the next thing everyone saw was both halves of the pirate ship split into two right down the middle, causing the ship to split into 4 pieces. Zoro and the chefs stared at the sight with eyes as wide as dinner plates. The pirates, along with Krieg, who were still on the ship, were screaming and clutching on pieces of wood that broke off of the ship in order to stay afloat. Krieg himself managed to climb back onto a piece of the ship and stood there soaking wet and stared at Luffy with a look of pure hatred. Luffy paid him no mind. Instead, he turned towards Zoro and spoke. "Still think you got what it takes?" Luffy asked. Zoro looked at him for a while before he tightens his bandana around his head and spoke. "Only one way to find out," he said before he leapt off of the restaurant and landed on a large piece of the ship that broke off. Luffy sighed and looked towards Mihawk before he spoke. "I want him back alive, Hawkeye," Luffy said with a sigh. Mihawk looked at Zoro for a while before he turned and looked towards Luffy and spoke with a light chuckle. "I'll try," he said, causing Luffy to narrow his eyes. Zoro then unsheathed all of his swords and spoke to Mihawk. "Dracula Mihawk," he said, getting everyone's attention. "I challenge you to a duel for the title of World's Strongest Swordsman," Zoro said with conviction, causing Mihawk to step off of his coffin-shaped boat and hop onto the same broken piece of the ship before he spoke. "Luffy was right. You have no idea just how big this world is and just how little a fish you are in this world," Mihawk said, pissing Zoro off. Zoro was about to charge towards Hawkeye, but before he could, everyone heard someone yelling off to their right. "Lluffyy," came the voice that was too familiar for Zoro and Luffy. Everyone turned towards their right and saw Usopp, Johnny, and Yosaku on a small lifeboat rowing towards them. The one thing Luffy noted was that Nami was not with them. "What's wrong and where is Nami?" Luffy asked as he walked over to the side to meet them. Usopp, after he finally stopped, yelled, "Calm down," and spoke to Luffy. "It's Nami. She tossed us off of the ship and stole it," Usopp said. As soon as he said that, Luffy turned his head quickly towards Zoro and yelled out. "I thought I told you to keep an eye on her," Luffy yelled at Zoro. Zoro took his sword out of his mouth and replied to Luffy. "I was watching her all the time before he left to go move the ship," Zoro yelled back. "How was I supposed to know she was going to steal the ship?" Zoro asked. Luffy was about to reply, but Mihawk spoke before he could say anything. My looks like you already have a mutiny on your crew, Luffy," Mihawk said with a chuckle, pissing Luffy off. Soon blue electric sparks could be seen around Luffy's body, the wind started to pick up and skies overhead started to darken and was completely covered with thunderclouds. All of a sudden a loud booming thunder sounded overhead, scaring everyone, even Mihawk, a bit. Luffy then turned towards Zoro and spoke in a deadly tone. "Hurry up whatever you are doing there and go get me my ship back while I get a cook and kill Krieg," Luffy said, causing Zoro to nod his head in agreement. Luffy then turned towards Usopp and spoke. "After Zoro finishes, I want you guys to follow Nami and get the ship back. I will be right behind you guys and I will deal with Nami myself," Luffy said, causing everyone there to think one thing in common. "I feel sorry for her," they all thought. Luffy then turned towards Zoro and Mihawk to watch their fight, which had already begun. Mihawk was fighting Zoro with a small dagger that Luffy knew he carried hidden in the cross pendant around his neck. Luffy could see Zoro was trying his hardest but couldn't match Mihawk's skill, but was pissed off because Mihawk was using a small dagger and not his actual sword. Luffy and everyone there watches as Mihawk stops Zoro's strongest attack with little to no effort at all. "Welcome to the real world, Zoro," Luffy thought as he watched Zoro start to question his strength after having his attack stopped. Everyone around couldn't believe what they were seeing. They couldn't believe that even the great bounty hunter Zoro couldn't beat Mihawk. Luffy paid no attention to murmurings that were happening around, instead he kept his eyes on Zoro. The next thing that happened surprised everyone, including Luffy. Mihawk stabbed Zoro right in the chest. From the angle that Luffy was standing, it looked as though Zoro got stabbed right in his heart. However, even though he was stabbed, Zoro did not back down, he did not fall. Instead, he placed his guard up and attacked Mihawk again. Luffy could see that they were talking to each other, but he could not hear what they were saying. Whatever Zoro said to Hawkeye, it made he smile before he took out his actual sword and slashed at Zoro, breaking two of his swords and cutting him across his chest. Zoro then fell into the water, causing Usopp and the bounty hunter duo to scream out. "Zoro!" they yelled as they jumped into the water to save Zoro. Luffy placed his hand on his sword and unsheathed it, all while staring at Mihawk, who was staring right back at Luffy with a smirk on his face. The next thing everyone was Luffy disappear from where he was standing, causing the pirates and cook's eyes to widen at the speed he possessed. The next thing everyone heard metal hitting metal right before a huge shock wave was felt, causing debris to go flying all over the place, along with knocking a few chefs and pirates off their feet, while at the same time creating large waves blocking the restaurant and the unstable pieces of what's left of the Krieg pirate ship. At first, it puzzled everyone when it came to where the shockwave came from. It wasn't until they looked at the center of everything only to see Mihawk and Luffy standing there with their swords clashing. Luffy looked eyes with Mihawk before he spoke. "I thought I said I want him back alive," Luffy said before he pushed off of Mihawk's sword and placed some distance between him and Mihawk. Mihawk placed his guard up before he replied to Luffy. "Guess I got carried away," he said. As he said that, Luffy kicked off and rushed him faster than anyone's eyes could track. Mihawk was barely able to raise his sword in order to block Luffy downward slashed. As the two swords connected, it created another shockwave, causing a lot of pirates and chefs to fall over. Krieg stared at the two swordsmen with wide eyes before he whispered to himself. "Such power in a single swing of their swords," he whispered as he stared at Luffy and Mihawk as they squared off in the middle of everyone. Sanji, who also had his eyes widen at the sheer power of the two men, couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Are they even human?" Sanji asked out loud. Zeph scoffed and folded his arms before he replied. "That's what exists in the Grand Line," he said before he tapped Sanji's shoulder, causing him to look at Zeph. "Look at the sky," he said as he pointed to the sky. Sanji and the rest of the chefs, along with the Krieg pirates and Usopp and company, looked up to the sky to see all of the previous thunderclouds were split right down the middle, creating a sort of trench in the sky. Clouds from both sides were rushing into the trench, but neither one dare crossed over the trench. Everyone stared at the sky in utter disbelief. "They split the sky. No, the heavens in two," a scared cook said in a surprised voice. Everyone was brought of their staring by Zoro's voice. "Luffy!" Zoro yelled out, getting everyone's attention, especially Luffy and Mihawk, who separated the moment they heard Zoro's voice. Luffy looked over to Zoro to see him laying on his back with one hand holding the only sword he has left in the air. "Luffy, can you hear me?" Zoro asked in a shaky voice. Luffy sighed before he chuckled and resheathed his sword before he replied with a smile. Yeah, I hear you, Luffy said. Zoro took a breath before he began to speak again. Sorry for worrying you, Zoro said, causing Luffy to smile. If I don't become the greatest swordsman in the world, you'd be in a dilemma now, right? He said before he coughed up some blood, causing the bounty hunter duo to yell at him to stop and save his energy, which Zoro ignored and continued to speak instead. I will never lose again, Zoro yelled out with tears streaming down his face. Until I defeat him and become the world's greatest swordsman, I'll never be defeated anymore. As Zoro said that, Mihawk and Luffy's face split into a wide grin after hearing what Zoro said. Do you have a problem with that, Pirate King? Zoro asked. Luffy chuckled to himself before he replied. Not a single problem, Luffy said. Luffy then turned to Mihawk and saw him standing there with his arms folded and his sword already strapped to his back. Luffy was about to speak to him, but Mihawk looks in the direction and spoke first. It is still too early for you to die. My name is Hawkeye Mihawk. You are strong, but there is still much for you to learn. No matter how much years it takes, I will hold this title as the greatest in the world and wait for you. Until that day you must hone your skills, then seek me out, Roronoa Zoro, Hawkeye said, surprising everyone there including Luffy. Hawkeye then turned towards Luffy and spoke. Is your goal still to become the king of the pirates? He asked. Luffy smirked before he replied. You already know the answer to that question, Luffy said, causing Mihawk to chuckle before he started walking back to his boat. As he was walking away, Luffy spoke once again. By the way, he said, getting Mihawk's attention, if you come across Shanks, let him know I'll be entering paradise in a week, he said before he turned and headed back to the floating restaurant. Mihawk turned back around and continued to walk to his boat. As he was about to reach his boat, the sound of someone landing of the piece the broken ship got his and everyone's attention. He looked over his shoulder to see Don Krieg standing there in his golden armor. Hawkeye, Krieg said, making Hawkeye's turn around to look at him. I was under the impression you were here to kill me, Krieg said. Hawkeye looked at him with a bored expression on his face before he replied. I was, but I had enough fun for today. So, I am going back home to rest, he said before he turns around and began walking back to his boat. As he was walking back to his boat, Krieg spoke again. That's too bad, because I am just getting started, he said as he pulled out 2 pistols and activated his hidden guns that were hidden under his armor and aimed it all at Mihawk. Just as he was about to pull the trigger, a bolt of lightning came out of the sky and struck Krieg, causing him to collapse on the ground smoking. Everyone stared at the smoking form of Krieg with wide eyes before he looked back up at the cloudy sky. It is as though the gods themselves judged Krieg, Patty said in a voice of utter disbelief as he stared up at the sky. Luffy was looking at all of them with an amused look on his face. You know I could have handled that, Luffy. I didn't need your help, Mihawk said, causing everyone to look at Luffy with eyes the size of dinner plates. Luffy chuckled before he replied. I know, but I got a deal with the old man, he said, earning a nod from Mihawk before he stepped onto his boat and sailed away. Luffy then turned his attention towards Usopp and company, who had just got finished bandaging up Zoro. Usopp, Luffy called out, getting his attention. You 4 head after Nami. I will catch up with once I get the cook, Luffy said, making Usopp standing up straight and salute him before he replied. You can count on the great Captain Usopp to get the ship back, Usopp said before the 4 of them sailed after Nami. Luffy then looked at Zeph and spoke. I do hope our deal still stands, Luffy asked, earning a chuckle and a nod from Zeph. Good, he said before he turned and looked at Krieg, who was now trying to stand back up. Luffy turned his body to lightning, surprising everyone there, and teleported himself in front of Krieg. When Krieg stood up straight, he saw Luffy standing right in front of him, looking at him with a bored expression on his face. Krieg stared right back at Luffy with a look of pure hatred before he raised one of his pistols and pointed it at Luffy's head. The chefs were beginning to get worried for Luffy, while the pirates all smiled at the fact that their captain was going to kill the Straw Hat Boy. Even though he had a gun pointed to his head, Luffy's expression didn't change. He had that same bored expression on his face, which pissed Krieg off even more. One of the chefs was about to yell at Luffy to move out of the way, but before he could, Krieg pulled the trigger. What happened next surprised everyone, even Krieg and Zeph. The bullet hit Luffy right between the eyes and seemed to just pass right through him as though he was a ghost. When Krieg saw this, he stumbled back a few steps in surprise before he pulled the trigger again and again, only to have the same thing happen each time. Dropping his gun, Krieg began to stutter. "Why, you ate a devil fruit," he said, surprising everyone who was there. People around Luffy began murmuring about hearing about devil fruits and myths about devil fruits. Luffy just tuned all of them out and focused on Krieg, who regained his composure and began to speak. "It doesn't matter if you ate a devil fruit or not," he said, causing the murmuring to stop and Luffy to raise an eyebrow in curiosity. "I'll just blow you into the water and have you drown," he said before he reached behind him and pulled out a spear with two big gold plates, like the ones on his shoulder, on the side. Krieg then rushed towards Luffy and tried to strike him in his chest, but Luffy sidestepped and grabbed the wooden pole of the spear with his left hand and held onto it, preventing Krieg from pulling it away. "You are without a doubt the biggest idiot I have ever met," Luffy said in a bored tone as he held on the spear. "What did you say, brat?" asked an angry Krieg. Luffy just sighed before he replied. "What kind of idiot puts a metal spear with two giant gold-plated discs on a piece of stick?" Luffy yelled before he crushed the wooden stick with his left hand, causing Krieg's eyes to widen. As the tip of the spear was falling to the ground, Luffy spun clockwise and kicked it in the direction of Krieg's ship. The spear sailed in the air before he stuck onto Krieg's ship right in the middle of a group of pirates. As the tip hit the ground, it exploded, blowing the group of pirates away and into the water. Luffy then looked at Krieg, who had a look of fear written all over his face. Faster than anyone could blink, Luffy grabbed onto Krieg's face and smashed his head into the ground. Luffy then stood up and placed his right foot on Krieg's chest plate before he spoke. "You should be careful walking around with all this metal, Krieg," Luffy said in a voice that sent chills down the spine of everyone there. "You could get struck by lightning," he said before he covered his entire body in lightning and electrocuted Krieg. Everyone staring at the scene could clearly see Krieg was in a great deal of pain and he was trying to scream, yet no voice came out. Jin stared at his captain with wide eyes. He wanted to help his captain, but fear didn't let him move from the spot that he was in. Luffy electrocuted Krieg for about 4 minutes before he finally turned off the lightning and stepped off of Krieg and began walking back to the chefs. Everyone stared at Krieg to see if he was going to get up, but with one look everyone there knew. Don Krieg, the pirate admiral and ruler of the East Blue, was dead. As Luffy was walking back to the restaurant, he stopped and turned to the pirates and looked at them with cold eyes, causing them to flinch under his gaze. "I suggest all of you get out of here before I kill you as well," Luffy said, causing them to scramble and run to find pieces of the broken ship to use as a boat. When Luffy reached the chefs, Zeph was the first one to speak. "You are just going to let them go?" he asked. Luffy chuckled and smiled at him before he spoke. "A dead man tells no tales," he said before he walked into the restaurant. As he said that, Zeph started to laugh. "Indeed they don't," Zeph said before he followed Luffy into the restaurant along with the rest of the cooks. Chapter 10. Farewells and Fishmen. Luffy was currently sitting at one of the tables in the restaurant eating a bowl of soup with Sanji and all of the chefs. It had been a few hours since Luffy defeated Krieg and everything seemed to have calmed down a bit. Other than a few pirates who chose to give up the pirate's life to become waiters at the restaurant, everything was somewhat peaceful. That was until he heard Patty yell out. "Who made this soup?" he asked loudly. Sanji got up from his seat with a smile on his face and walked over to Patty before he spoke. "I did," he said with a smile. "Isn't it the best soup you ever tasted?" he asked. However, what Patty said next wiped the happy smile right off of his face and replaced it with an angry scowl. "More like the worst soup I ever tasted," Patty said before he tossed the bowl of soup on the ground. Sanji then grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and yelled at him. "What did you said, you bastard?" he asked angrily. Before Patty could reply, some more cooks started to comment on the soup. "Yay, this thing this disgusting," said one chef. "Taste like garbage in a bowl to me," said another. It continued like that for a while before every chef in the restaurant was yelling at Sanji for how disgusting his soup was. Luffy was beyond confused. He was wondering if he was eating the same soup that everyone else was tasting. He looked over next to Patty at the pot that was on the table to see if it was the same pot that he took his food out from. To Luffy's surprise, it was the exact same pot. So, he took his spoon and took another taste of his soup, while ignoring the fight that broke out between Sanji and the chefs behind him. The soup tasted amazing to Luffy. It reminded him of the home-cooked food that Makino used to cook for him when he was a kid on Dawn Island. Luffy was interrupted from his reminiscing by the sound of what Luffy could make out as Zeph's wooden leg hitting the floor as he walked. The sound got everyone in the restaurant's attention. They all looked at the stairs to see Zeph walking down the stairs with a spoon in his hand. He walked straight to the pot of soup on the table before he dipped his spoon into the pot and scooped up some soup. All of the commotion stopped. People who were fighting and eating all paused and looked at Zeph with bated breath to see what he would say about the soup. In Luffy's mind, if there was anyone who could truly judge the taste of the soup and be right about it, was Zeph. Zeph placed a spoonful of the soup in his mouth and swirled it around in his mouth to get a good taste of it before he gave his opinion. "This soup is horrible," he said before he spat on the floor. As he said that, Luffy had his jaw practically hanging. He was about to take a sip of his whiskey before he stopped and looked at the glass and think to himself, "Is the whiskey burning away my taste buds?" He thought to himself before he shrugged his shoulders and tossed his drink back and savored the taste. He then turned his attention to Sanji, who was walking over to Zeph with an angry expression on his face. "What did you say, you only geezer?" Sanji yelled. Zeph folded his arms before he replied. "You heard me the first time, brat," he said before he turned around and started walking back towards the kitchen. As he was walking, he looked over his shoulder and spoke to Sanji once more. "Might as well join that kid's pirate crew because I don't need a crappy cook like you working here," Zeph said. Luffy, who saw how much that comment hit Sanji and decided to add his 2 cents. So, he got up with his bowl and walked over to the pot and started to take out some more soup. As he was serving himself seconds, he spoke to the entire restaurant. "You know, I don't know what you guys are talking," he said, getting all of their attention. "This is the best soup I've had in years," he said, causing Sanji to smile. Sanji then looked at Luffy before looking back and Zeph and spoke. "Fine then," he said, making everyone look at him. "If you bastards can't appreciate good cooking, then I'll just go where my cooking will be appreciated," he said before turning towards Luffy, who was walking back to his table. "You got yourself a cook, Luffy," he said before walking out of the restaurant. As he said that, Luffy smiled at the fact that he just found his cook. Now all he needed to do was go sort out his navigator issues. As soon as Sanji walked out of the restaurant, Luffy looked at Zeph and spoke. "You know, I really didn't taste anything wrong with the soup," he said, causing Zeph to chuckle and a few of the chefs to look at him slightly ashamed, which confused Luffy. "There is nothing wrong with the soup," Zeph said with a warm smile on his face. "Sanji is a great cook, one of the best chefs in the restaurant," Patty said, causing a few of the other chefs to nod in agreement. "So, why did you tell him his food sucks?" Luffy asked before he started to eat his food. Zeph walked over to Luffy's table and sat down opposite him before he started to speak. "That boy is extremely stubborn. He has dreams of his own, yet he sticks around this restaurant thinking that he needed to repay a debt that I never expected him to pay back," Zeph said, causing Luffy to nod his head, showing he understood what Zeph was saying. "He would have never left on his own," he said with a chuckle. "So, we decided to give him a push. A pretty hard push," Patty added, making everyone laugh. It was at that moment that Luffy's observation haki alerted him that Sanji was standing at the door listening to everything everyone was saying about him. Luffy smiled and said nothing. Instead, he got up and headed towards the back door to meet Sanji. When he got out there, he saw him leaning over the side of the ship with tears in his eyes. Luffy walked and stood next to him with his back braced against the side of the ship. "Got any dream, Sanji?" Luffy asked, getting his attention. Sanji wiped his eyes before taking out a cigarette and lighting it. "Yeah, I got one that I want to achieve before I die," he said before he took a deep pull on his cigarette. "Have you ever heard of the All Blue?" he asked. Luffy turned away from him and looked up to the sky and sighed before he replied. "Yeah, I have," Luffy said, surprising Sanji. "It is said it is a mystical sea of legend, rumored to be the only place in the world where the North, South, East, and West seas meet. In this legendary ocean, it is said that there are fish from each of the 4 seas. From what I heard, it is the ultimate dream of every chef," Luffy said before looking back at Sanji to see his eyes were wide at the fact that Luffy had heard about the All Blue. Do you think it exists? Sanji asked in a voice that sounded as though he was scared of the answer. Don't know, Luffy said, making Sanji's mood drop a bit. However, Luffy continued, causing Sanji to look up at him with hopeful eyes. There is only one way to find out whether it exists or not, he said with a grin, causing Sanji to grin alongside him. Guess there is only one way, huh? He asked rhetorically with a smirk on his face. Luffy then turned around and looked out into the open sea with a smirk of his own and spoke. Let's turn this world upside down, he said in a voice filled with conviction before he turned to Sanji and spoke again. Go get your stuff ready. We need to leave as soon as possible, he said before starting off in the direction that Nami went. I have a thief to catch, he said before heading back inside. When he got inside, he saw everyone was cleaning up the restaurant and a few chefs were sitting back relaxing. Luffy walked over to an empty table and sat down with a glass in his hand before he poured himself some whiskey to drink. While Luffy was enjoying his drink, the doors of the restaurant came flying off of its hinges and something came crashing in. Everyone in the restaurant was startled by the sudden change of events. It went from being a calm and peaceful moment to one long and scary one. A lot of the chefs thought it was the Krieg pirate came back for revenge, or the Marines heard about the fight between Luffy and Krieg and had come to arrest everyone. When the dust cloud finally settled, everyone was left staring at a truly strange sight. Laying on the ground was a man inside of a shark's mouth. For the second time today, Luffy was left wondering if he should stop drinking. He looked around to see if everyone was seeing the same thing that he was seeing, and much to his surprise they were. Is that a fishman? Asked one of the cooks. Did he come all the way from Fishman Island just to eat here? Another cook said, going off of the previous. You idiot, it is a human in a pan shark, Patty said to the two cooks. Luffy finally decided to get up from where he was sitting and walked over to get a good look at the man. What he saw caused his eyes to widen. It was Yosaku. Yosaku! Luffy yelled before he pulled him out of the shark's mouth. When he pulled him out of the shark's mouth, some of the chefs picked up the shark and set it free while another brought a blanket for Yosaku. After sitting him down in a shark, Luffy then began to question Yosaku. Why are you here? Where are the others? Did you find Nami? He asked. Yosaku wrapped himself up in a blanket before he spoke in a somber tone. We never actually caught up with her, but from the direction she is heading, we think we've figured out where Big Sis is going and what she plans on doing, he said, causing Luffy to narrow his eyes a bit. I see, he said before taking a sip of his whiskey. So we can get the ship back, Luffy said, causing Yosaku to look down a bit before he replied. Maybe, he said, causing Luffy to raise an eyebrow. But if our suspicion turns out to be true, then the place she is going could mean certain death to all of us if we follow her, Yosaku said, surprising Luffy and everyone there with that comment. The point is, we really need your help, big bro Luffy. Please come with me, Yosaku said in a desperate voice. Okay, I don't really get it, but I got it. Let's go, Luffy said before he started walking towards the front door, with Yosaku following right behind him along with all of the chefs who want to say goodbye. As they were walking out of the door, everyone saw Sanji standing there with a bag over his shoulder. He then looked towards Luffy and spoke. Are you ready to go, Captain? He asked, surprising the chefs that were there. Yeah, looks like the rest of the guys are going to need some help, Luffy said before he walked towards the edge of the restaurant with Yosaku, leaving Sanji to say goodbye. He could hear Sanji in the background yelling at the cooks about their bad acting, and he could also hear Sanji crying while he thanked Zeph for all he did for him throughout the years. Luffy then decided to block out Sanji and look up to the sky and began concentrating to summon a cloud for them to ride on. A small part of the sky began to be filled with a small number of thunderclouds. After the size was suitable to Luffy's liking, the cloud started to descend from the sky to the restaurant. By now Sanji had finished thanking Zeph and came to stand next to Luffy, not noticing the cloud coming down from the sky. How are we going there? He asked while wiping the remaining tears away from his eyes. If you want, I have a small boat that would be able to carry us, he said. Luffy didn't say anything, he simply pointed up at the sky, causing Sanji and the chefs to look up as well. To say they were surprised at what they saw would be an understatement. Their eyes were as wide as he can be and their jaws were practically hanging from their mouth as they saw a thunder slowly descending from the sky and stopping at the feet of Luffy. When the cloud arrived, Luffy jumped on, surprising everyone, except for Yosaku who had seen it before. From the cloud, a throne was formed along with 2 seats in front of the throne. He then looked at Sanji and Yosaku and spoke. "Are you two going to stand there all day or get on already?" He asked rhetorically, knocking the 2 of them out of their staring. They quickly hopped into the cloud and sat down in the seats. As he sat down, a bolt of lightning came out of the cloud and went around them, strapping them to their seats. Luffy then turned towards Zeph and spoke. "Do take care of yourself, old man," he said before the cloud raced away across the water at an amazing speed in the direction of where the others went. "Cheeky brat," Zeph said as he stared at the cloud getting smaller and smaller as he sped away. Back on the cloud, Luffy was calmly sitting on his throne pouring himself a drink while Sanji and Yosaku were poking and touching the cloud, trying to wrap their head around the fact that they are riding on a cloud. "How are you able to do this?" asked an astonished Sanji. Luffy took a sip of his drink before he replied. "I ate a lightning devil fruit. I can control lightning and become lightning itself," he said as he turned his right hand into a large bolt of lightning. "For some reason, I can control thunderclouds to a certain degree. It surprised me as well when I first discovered it," Luffy said. Sanji nodded his head and went back to admiring the cloud, but was interrupted when Luffy spoke to Yosaku. "So, Yosaku," he said, getting Yosaku's attention. "Do you want to tell us what is so bad about where Nami is going?" he asked. Yosaku then sat as straight and spoke to both Luffy and Sanji. She went to Arlong," he said, causing Luffy to narrow his eyes and Sanji raise his eyebrows. "Arlong, as in, Saw-Tooth, Arlong?" Luffy asked in a surprised voice. Yosaku nodded his head before he spoke again. Nami couldn't stop looking at Arlong's picture when she saw it. And it wasn't a normal kind of stare, there was something different about the way she was staring, something focused. "I'm telling you, Nami is planning of taking down Arlong and collecting the 20 million berry bounty," Yosaku said, causing Sanji's eyes to widen. Luffy didn't say anything, he simply waited for Yosaku to continue before he said anything because something did not add up in Luffy's mind. The warlord and captain of the Fishman Pirates, Jimbe, left Arlong here in the East Blue, and since coming here he has taken control of 20 towns, Yosaku said, surprising Sanji once more. As Yosaku was about to speak, Luffy interrupted him. "Jimbe didn't leave Arlong here to cause trouble. The 2 of them had a fallen out a long time ago, and Arlong and a few other fishmen who think themselves to be superior to humans took up shop in the East Blue after leaving the Fishman Pirates," Luffy said, shedding some light on the subject. "How do you know that?" asked Sanji, getting a nod from Yosaku, showing he too wanted to know how Luffy knew that. "I met Jimbe a long time ago when I went to Fishman Island," Luffy said, surprising the 2 passengers on the cloud. "He was really nice. He even gave me meat," Luffy said with a smile, causing the 2 of them to sweat drop. "Anyway, while I was there he told me the story of Fisher Tiger and other stories about his pirate journey. The story about Arlong happened to be one of them," he finished. "Wow, you went to Fishman Island," Sanji said with a weird look on his face. "You've got to tell me, are the mermaids as beautiful as the stories say?" he asked with hearts in his eyes while his cigarette was puffing out heart-shaped smoke. "The stories don't do them justice," Luffy said, causing Sanji to have a nosebleed. "But you don't have to take my word for it, you can see for yourself when we go there," Luffy said, causing Sanji to smile widely and started singing about how many mermaids he's going to marry. Luffy just shook his head and turned to Yosaku and told him to continue where he left off. "Arlong set up his main base of operation on Konami Islands. He calls it Arlong Park, and that's where Nami is headed," Yosaku said. Luffy sighed and took a sip of his drink before he replied. "This girl is more trouble than she is worth," he said while massaging his forehead with his right hand. "I mean, if she wants to kill Arlong for his bounty, why didn't she just say so and all of us would have helped her? Is she that greedy that she wants it all for herself?" he asked, causing the 2 of them to shrug their shoulders. "Something about her behavior doesn't add up." "Hold on tight," Luffy said, suddenly puzzling Sanji and Yosaku. Then all of a sudden the thundercloud that they were riding on sped up and angled itself upward a bit and began to climb higher and higher in the sky. "What are you doing?" screamed Yosaku. "Going to a higher altitude. We will get there faster this way," he said before he increased the speed of the cloud once more. Now the cloud was flying across the sky at about 80 miles per hour and was about 20,000 feet in the air. Yosaku and Sanji looked beyond scared at the height they were. Sanji was doing a better job of hiding it while Yosaku was screaming for his life. After traveling for about 30 minutes high in the clouds, the thundercloud began to descend from the sky until it was back to about 10 feet above the water. Looking ahead of them they could see an island in the distance. Luffy looked to Yosaku, who was trying to compose himself and spoke. "Is that the island?" he asked. Yosaku looked ahead of the cloud before he spoke. "Yeah, that's it," he said while pointing ahead. "And that's Arlong Park right there," he said pointing at the silhouette of the tall building just at the front of the island. As he said that, Luffy turned the cloud to the right and started moving away from Arlong Park. "What are you doing? Arlong Park is right there," Yosaku asked with a confused look on his face. "We are going to the other side of the island. Let's find Zoro and the rest of the guys before we go tearing this place apart," he said, getting a nod of agreement from Yosaku and Sanji. They flew around the island until they reached the rear shore that looked to be secluded enough for them not to be noticed by anyone. The cloud flew ashore before coming to a stop. When it stopped, the lightning bolts that were holding Sanji and Yosaku in their seats disappeared. Luffy then stood up from his throne, soon followed by Sanji and Yosaku. The cloud then began to get closer and closer to the ground until it touched the ground. Upon contact with the ground, it slowly started to dissipate until the entire cloud was gone and 3 boys were left standing in the shore. "So what now, Captain?" asked Sanji as he lit a new cigarette. Luffy looked around for a bit before he replied. "There doesn't seem to be any towns or villages nearby," Luffy said while using his observation haki to check around for people. "There is probably one more inland. For now, I think we just need to find the rest of the guys," he said. "How are we going to do that, big bro Luffy?" asked Yosaku with a confused look on his face. Luffy thought for a bit before he came up with an idea. "I think we just let them know we're here on the island and then take it from there," he said, confusing both Sanji and Yosaku. "And how do you plan on letting them know?" Sanji asked, causing Luffy to smirk. "You'll see," he said before looking up to the sky. At Arlong Park *, sitting tied up in front of what looks to be some kind of pool is Zoro. Surrounding him are numerous fishmen and Nami. Sitting behind Nami is the leader of the Arlong pirates, Arlong. Arlong is a large, muscular, light blue saw shark fishman. He has long, black hair with a widow's peak reaching down to his shoulders, under a brown ushanka. He has a fin on his nape, surrounded by his hair, and the gills are located on both the sides of his neck. On the left side of his chest is the tattoo of the Fishman Pirates, while his own Jolly Roger is on his lower left arm. He was sitting on a white lawn chair staring at Zoro, who was staring at Nami. "I guess you finally get it. I just used you guys to get what I wanted. You were skilled enough to get me my needs, but boy were you guys a bunch of suckers," Nami said with a smug look on her face, causing Zoro to grit his teeth. The moment she said that, Arlong started laughing. "She had you guys completely fooled. It's no use, she is cold-blooded. She betrayed her own family for money, so you really shouldn't feel too bad," Arlong said, causing Nami to flinch, which didn't go unnoticed by Zoro. "If I were you, I would just admit defeat and try to forget the day you even met her," he said, causing Zoro to look down a bit before he started to chuckle, which puzzled everybody including Nami. Here was a man who was most likely about to die and he is laughing as though everything is alright. "Forget about it?" Zoro asked rhetorically. "That's kinda impossible. And as for the thing about us trusting her, we didn't." "Well, the captain sure didn't," Zoro said, surprising everyone including Nami. "The only reason she stole our ship is 'cause I wasn't watching, as the captain told me to. I got distracted a bit," he said. "What are you talking about?" Nami asked. Zoro chuckled some more before he replied. "You see, the captain told me to keep an eye on you before we went to that restaurant, but after someone showed up I got distracted and took my eyes off you," he said, causing Nami to scoff at him. "And as for not being able to forget about this, let's just say she pissed off the wrong person," Zoro said cryptically. Arlong was watching the interaction with narrowed eyes along with every other fishman. "What are you talking about?" Nami asked in a curious voice. Zoro's face took on a serious look before he answered. "You joined the captain's crew, then committed treason, and on top of them stole his ship with his Jolly Roger on it," Zoro said, scaring Nami a bit. You don't really think there won't be any repercussions for your actions, do you? He asked with a smirk on his face. He is probably on his way here right now, and for your sake, you better hope he calmed down a bit from the last time I saw him, he said. As he said that, a large shadow was cast over Arlong Park and was spreading outwards towards the sea. Everyone looked up and was surprised by what they saw, well, everyone except Nami and Zoro. Nami's face lost all color while Zoro was smiling as he looked up to the sky. Up in the sky, lightning could be seen flashing and striking random parts of the island. Then out of nowhere, a loud thunderclap was heard throughout the island and in a few neighboring islands. The fishmen were confused at what they were seeing. It was as though a major storm just came out of nowhere without any warning. Zoro and Nami, however, they knew that wasn't a normal storm. That could only mean one thing. Luffy was here and he is still pissed. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment and subscribe, as well as checking out the author on fanfiction.net.